Welcome to Kubernetes SIG Apps for April 2nd, 2018. And I am Matt Farina. I'll be chairing today. And so the first thing I'll do is I'll share into the chat here the meeting minutes and notes that we take every week. And with that, we do have one announcement, and that is that Kubernetes 1.10 came out last week. Now, normally we would have a retrospective after that. Jace has kindly come in for quite some time and done that. Unfortunately, he's not able to make it today or for the first several Mondays this month. We're working on finding somebody else. We're hoping to have a retrospective maybe next week that we're going to have this week. Instead of that, we're going to have a demo, and we've got some discussion topics for this week. And so with that, Ivan, are you on to talk about FNord? Is that how you pronounce it?
FNord.
FNord,
Yes, I am.
okay, I should have known I'd butcher it. So with that, the floor is yours to give us a demo.
Okay, great. All right, well, so this demo is going to show a workload prototype called FNord that we've been working on for multi-cluster. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and kind of talk about the existing setup. So bear with me just 1 second. All right, you should see what I'm sharing now.
I can see your screen.
Perfect. All right. So we're kind of looking to get some feedback from the SIG Apps team here and provide any feedback or any sort of comments. We're looking to sort of see possibly maybe Helm version 3 integration in the future or various different directions we could take this stuff. But for now, I'll just kind of go quickly and show you sort of an existing setup that we have for workloads across multiple clusters. So right now I have 2 independent Kubernetes clusters that are running. One is US West and one is US East. And I will show you the config. This is a kube config, so you can see that there's 2 clusters in here that are running. So in order to actually distribute workloads on these clusters, we need to join them to the workload API server and controller. And so the US West cluster right now is running the workload API server and controller. And it's also running a cluster registry API server in order to handle the cluster objects. And these are basically just Kubernetes API endpoints right now. And so let's go ahead and join both of these clusters. And right now we have a tool called kubefnord, which you can use to actually join these clusters into a set of workload clusters. So the host cluster context is basically the cluster that's running the workload API server and controller. And we'll go ahead and join this cluster and call it US West. And at the same time, we're going to add it to the cluster registry as well. So now that that's done, we can go ahead and do the same thing for the US East cluster. And basically what this will do is create a namespace in the joining cluster and also create some credentials and RBAC resources in order for the workload controller to access resources in that cluster. So basically now we have, let's go ahead and get the federated clusters. So let me clear my screen and do that again. So you can see we have both of these clusters now that are registered and available to handle workloads. So if we go ahead and describe them, scroll up a little bit here, you can see that the US East cluster is ready. And similarly down here, we can see that the US West cluster is ready. So now we have a set of clusters that we can run workloads against. And so now I'll transition to actually show how we can distribute some workloads on these clusters. So there's a set of configurations in this directory. I won't go into all of them, but I will go in and describe replica sets as one of the more interesting examples. So we currently support distributing workloads for namespaces. The resources that we support are namespaces, config maps, secrets, and replica sets, and also deployments, but we'll just show replica sets in this demo here. So if we look at replica sets, we have a new custom resource type called Federated Replica Set. And the name of it is test replica set. And we want it in the test namespace. And this resource basically embeds the Kubernetes. Oh, getting some feedback. Is there a question? Okay, yeah, so this resource basically embeds the Kubernetes replica set resource inside of it. Inside of its spec here, you can see we have a template field, and all of these fields should probably look familiar. They're just replica set fields, and we want to specify that we want 3 replicas. We have some dummy labels that we specify there, and the Nginx container image. So we also have a resource type, a new resource type called Federated Replica Set Override. And basically what this does is allow you to override certain parameters in your base replica set template here on the left. And so what we can override, for example, is that in the US East cluster, we want to specify 5 replicas instead of the 3 that we specified there on the left. So this resource type allows us to basically override some of those parameters. And lastly, I'll show you placement. Again, these are all for replica sets. And this one's called Federated, up on top here, Federated Replica Set Placement. And this one allows you to sort of provide rules on where you want your resource to be propagated. So here we are specifying that we want it to propagate in the cluster names US East and US West. Are there any questions on these resources? So these other resources are similar. We're going to basically propagate them to both the US East and the US West clusters and override just some, for example, config maps and secrets. We'll override just some basic data inside of that resource. But I'll only show replica sets in more detail just in the interest of time. So let's go ahead and create all of these resources. So now that those are created, we'll go and drill down into each of the clusters, into each of the clusters just to see how the resources were propagated. So this fancy for loop here will just loop through both clusters, and this particular case will just get the namespace, test namespace, to see that it's propagated to both clusters. So here we can see we have US West and US East, and our test namespace was created about 30 seconds ago. So similarly, we can do config maps, and you can see the test config map was propagated as well to both clusters. And we'll do secrets as well. You can see test secret here in both clusters. And lastly, show replica sets. And this is probably the more interesting one because you can quickly see that we specified 5 replicas in the US East cluster, and the West cluster got the 3 replicas that we had in the base template. So that kind of shows how you can override a parameter on a per cluster basis and provide a separate value for that field. So now I'll transition to show how you can move all the resources from one cluster to another. And we can do that by editing the federated namespace placement resource. We had called the namespace test namespace, if you recall a little bit earlier. And so if we edit this resource, we can basically remove the US East cluster, save that, and all the resources will move away from the US East cluster since we no longer want the namespace there. And I won't show you all of the resources, but I'll at least show you the replica sets. And you can see here that there are no longer any replica set resources in this cluster, in the US East cluster. The other resources are similar, but I won't go into each of those just in the interest of time. So similarly, if we want to scale them back onto the US East cluster, we can go ahead and re-edit the federated namespace placement resource, add the US East cluster back in there, save that, and you should see the resources scaled back onto that cluster. Should see them scale back here shortly. There we go. So we have the test replica set that's scaling back up to the 5 replica set, or the 5 replicas that we requested in that override. So you can see here that the Fedora prototype handles the workload by allowing you to join a couple clusters, in this case, to run workloads against. It allows you to specify the resource types that you want propagated, as well as some overrides that allow you to provide different values across different clusters, and then placement rules that allow you to dictate where you want that resource to be propagated. So that concludes this demo. Are there any questions?
Paul, you've got your hand up. Go ahead. Does anybody have any questions or any comments on this?
Hey, can folks hear me?
Yeah.
So, sorry, Zoom just died for me a couple times. So at the risk of repeating some of what Ivan said, I just wanted to give some context for this. So the reason that we're demoing to SIG Apps is that the problem of modeling in like the problem space of multi-cluster, where things should go and how they should be differentiated in different clusters, is very close to other things in the Kubernetes space. Like, for example, you may have heard of this tool called Helm, and the goal at this point that we're working towards in Federation Working Group is to find the right API constructions that we can apply to some API resources, and develop the right primitives for other things to target those APIs to be able to work on multiple clusters. So Ivan, I think, mentioned in the future possibly having like a Helm integration for this. We are looking to plant the seed among the folks that think hard about apps on Kubernetes, about how they may use these APIs in the future. And solicit feedback if about how people feel like in a gut way about these things. EOF. Nice demo, Ivan.
Yeah, no, great demo. And this is one of the questions I know I've been wondering about is when you get into the multi-cluster world, what are the best ways to do this? And I'd seen the first version of the Federation control plane, and I know there are folks who will manage it on their own as part of their CI tooling and say, do something to this cluster, do something to this other one, and manage it themselves. And so it's neat to see this come along. Thank you for demoing.
And I would just add, one of the challenges of Federation v1 is that it didn't really have the concept of scheduling applications. Like it could dynamically reallocate capacity across clusters, say if one cluster went down or didn't have enough capacity to run a given replica set. But maybe that replica set has a bunch of related resources and dependencies, and we have no way of representing that today. So we're very interested in like application CRD and things like that provide like a higher level view of what an application is. And it looks like, I mean, we're going to have to maybe evolve that in lockstep with SIG apps to make sure that it'll suit our use cases as well, or at least participate. I'm not saying you have to do what we want to do, but we definitely wouldn't want to have to reinvent this and do it on our own.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense.
Have you? I have a question. Maybe I missed it in the demo. I was distracted in the middle of it at one point. Have you thought about progressive rollout of changes across clusters?
So Brian, I think
that's the same thing I did.
It sounds like you're asking about when you change one of these resources, rolling out like in a kind of, an way analogous to how deployments are rolled out, except across multiple clusters.
I would say look at the ways that deployments actually aren't quite good enough even in a single cluster, because I think those things will be exacerbated in multi-cluster. Sorry to preempt you, Brian.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest that a common pattern is to, for example, deploy changes to a staging environment first, and then do changes progressively. Depending on how many clusters you have, it might be one cluster at a time, or it might be a production canary, even in the same cluster. And then, progress as you get increased confidence, roll out faster and faster, potentially across the remaining clusters if you have enough of them for that to matter.
I would say it's definitely in scope. I wouldn't say that we've spent a huge amount of time thinking about it yet, because getting to the point where we feel like the API constructions for the basic pieces that you just saw are the right things to move forward and think more about has basically been the story up until now.
Okay, well, I would definitely take a look at continuous deployment tools, because you're going to want a lot of the same mechanisms, or figure out how to compose with those. To delegate control of like automated canary analysis or manual judgments and things like that. Also, have you seen Conflate?
No.
No, I can send you a pointer to that. It's a way of doing overrides effectively.
Okay.
For arbitrary Kubernetes resources, using the underlying mechanisms like strategic merge, patch, and apply.
That's timely that you mentioned that. The formulation of overrides right now is like minimal, just to illustrate the concept. We have talked about potentially using strategic patch merge as a format for expressing them in the future. And just to circle back to earlier in this beat of the conversation, one of the other goals here is to make it, since we all have a lot of different opinions and different tools that we prefer to use. One of our goals is to make it so that you could use this set of APIs or patterns with a number of different propagation mechanisms. So for example, what we saw here today is like an active push reconciler. It should be possible to plug in something like kubeapplier as the propagation mechanism in the long term, since we don't expect people to agree on all things in this very meta problem space. And I think that probably the concerns about how do things get pushed out is something that seems to me like it's potentially in the propagation layer, and then potentially also at a higher level API that users actually relate to, that compiles, so to speak, to these APIs that you saw today. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Paul, just to jump in real quick, is there a place where you were planning on organizing a conversation around this particular topic and the other topics? Is it normally in SIG Federation? People are interested in that. Where's this conversation happening?
So there's a Federation working group, although I think in the new scheme it may be more appropriately called a sub-project of SIG multi-cluster, which is where the discussion usually happens.
Okay, so if anybody's interested in this, they should come over to SIG multi-cluster and start poking around?
Yeah, I'll drop a link to the SIG's README with all the coordinates and stuff in it.
Fantastic. Thank you. I have one other question on this. The repo itself, the tagline says Kubernetes Federation v2 prototype. It is not under the Kubernetes org, and I don't see things like the CLA and the associated repo stuff we've been talking about lately on it. Is there a path forward to this? What's happening with this code base here versus what happens with Kubernetes?
It's funny that you mentioned that. We have a request open to the steering committee to move this to Kubernetes SIG/Federation v2.
Okay.
I will respond to that thread as soon as I can, although I have a ton of meetings today.
Okay, I think Aaron is on top of it. So I expect that I will satisfy the criteria that Aaron put down shortly.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. All right, so folks who want this, please head over to SIG multi-cluster. I may end up being one of the people over there now. And so with that, we'll move on to the next topic. There was a proposed developer tools working group that came out on the Kubernetes dev mailing list. There's a link to it in the meeting minutes. And so there was quite a lengthy discussion on here, quite a lengthy discussion. And so one of the things that we thought about was what's the best way to present and talk about it, especially with the overlaps with SIG apps and the app dev working group and some of the other conversations that have been happening. And so we thought it would be a great idea to have a conversation here because so many of the relevant parties are here, especially Draft. We've demoed telepresence and others in this space. And so I'm not sure of the best way to approach talking about this and bringing it up other than, Kim, are you on the line?
I am. Hi.
Awesome. Hello, welcome. So Kim, you were the one who proposed this, and I know you work with Scaffold. Could you go ahead and give us the pitch on the working group, what you're thinking, goals, things of that nature?
Sure.
I have a quick tip for people who are on SIGs because it's happened a couple of times. Only one person in a room can have their mic and speaker on, and it needs to be the same person.
I'm muted.
Are we good now?
We are good.
Someone may have their speaker on.
Oh, I do, sir.
Hang on, it was Matt. So, hey everyone. So I'm pretty new to the Kubernetes world, and this is my first SIG Apps community group. So I joined the container tools team here at Google, and we just recently released Scaffold. And when we released it, a whole bunch of people pinged us and wanted to talk about it and wanted to hear things about our roadmap and what we were thinking, etc. And I was told about these working groups and the SIG apps, and we have several tools that span multiple SIGs. And so it was proposed that, hey, we should create a working group so we can have some more deeper technical and product discussions around these tools. So I think that's our main goal is we not only want to show off, what everyone is building, and we just really want to drive discussion and see where we can work together and hopefully not, creating the same things and things. So I think, I don't know if Matt on my team has some opinions about how we could make this working group successful, and definitely open to bringing back all the discussions we have, keeping everything public, making making it easily available for the things and the decisions that we make during the community groups.
Okay, no, that makes sense. So Let me ask this. So we wanted to have some discussions. Or did Matt want to say something? Is there somebody else? I know switching mics and things within a room. Yeah. Is there somebody else who wanted to chime in? No. Okay. So you wanted to have deeper discussion around some of the tools in this space. And if I understand it right, you talked about Scaffold, Draft, Telepresence, Weave, Flux, and Minikube, and tools like that. What kind of questions and discussions? So one of the things, and I'm actually glad Joe Beta is here, because we were looking at the scope of what is working group supposed to do. And if you look at it, for those of you who don't know the context, if you go look at SIGs, right, like SIG apps and SIG architecture and the rest, there's an immense amount of governance documentation on this. And when it comes to working groups, it's like a paragraph long. We discovered last week there's been a lot of talk on it, and we have a lot of underlying community assumptions on what should be there. But the reality is, it's only about a paragraph long in our governance. And so we've been talking about how do working groups form, when do they go away? They've never gone away. So we've got more than 30 SIGs now, and we've got 10 working groups, and we keep growing. And we know where it happens with SIGs, but what happens with working groups? And one of the things that we've started to do lately, which isn't codified yet, and I think Joe's the one who's actually working on codifying some of this for the steering committee, is to look at what are the goals of it and who's involved in it, and maybe even what are those things that could close out. So we're working with the app dev working group, and one of the questions that has come up lately is, have we closed out the goals to say the working group can be done now? And so I'm kind of curious of the discussions. Is this, so I see SIG, what is it, cluster lifecycle because of Minikube, SIG apps because of things like Draft and Scaffold tend to fall under that. And so we've got a couple of SIGs there. That would be maybe the sponsoring SIGs kind of thing. And then we look at the goals. So it's discussion to facilitate diving into just the deeper technical things around what people need, the problems are having.
Yeah, I think,
what's the kind of questions that we're trying to ferret out?
Howdy, this is Vic.
Hi, Vic.
So howdy. So I think one of the big things we want to figure out is what are the requirements for developer tooling? What is the things that developers want and need out of tooling that helps them be more efficient with Kubernetes as they develop? And I think there's a broad range of things that are there. Right now we have tools that implement various pieces of that and kind of trying to figure out what is the umbrella set of requirements and where can people apply effort to make those things kind of all stitched together into a nice story. So that's kind of the exploratory part. And then from there, I think actual work needs to happen, but I'm not sure that we know exactly what that world looks like or should look like in the future.
Let me chime in real quick. So a little background on me. So I've worked on Minikube, I've worked on Scaffold. And so basically these meetings have kind of been going on ad hoc so far. So, I mean, for the last year, we've had a sync with Red Hat and other folks interested in Minikube-like stuff. So we've been talking about, should we support multi-cluster? Do developers need multi-cluster? What the image we should use is for our VMs, like all sorts of questions like that don't really fit into SIG apps. They don't really fit into cluster lifecycle that much. And then with Scaffold, we've seen that there's a lot more questions in this space, including so we've been talking to Microsoft, Reddit, all of these companies have approached us wanting to talk about this, and these discussions have not been, they have been private, but they haven't been discoverable to the larger community. And we want to find a way that we can consolidate this and defragment these conversations a little bit. So, I mean, we in questions in products like Scaffold and Draft, we're talking about, I mean, what does the community need? Do they need, some sort of generation of these manifests? Do they need file watchers? Do they need, hot reloading? Do they need IDE integration? I don't think we've fully explored what the kind of feature set for these applications are yet. So, do we have language-specific workflows? And, we've really found that we needed kind of like a dedicated space to talk about these, to make sure that kind of the entire community was on the same page, and we're actually filling the gaps in the kind of developer workflow that we've seen.
So there's a question in the chat here for everybody, and Matt Butcher asked it. It says, "But why is SIG Apps not the place for this?"
So meaning like the weekly meeting.
Yeah, so we've got the weekly meetings, we've got the mailing list and the discussion topics, and we've been talking about the whole developer and DevOps space for a very long time. Just to give context, I mean, that was one of the original reasons that this SIG formed, was to talk about that tooling that sits on top of Kubernetes and deals with developer and operations, and how do you deal with those apps in Kubernetes? How do you operate them in? How do you build them? How much of the Kubernetes config files should be exposed to the end users and different kinds of end users. If you actually go look at our stuff that we've presented, we talk about app developers and app operators and how we're trying to understand their needs and meet their needs. Some of the tools that are now part of Kubernetes, then a whole bunch of the tools that are not part of Kubernetes that we also regularly discuss. And so the question is we've been having a lot of this discussion here. Why is this not the place to continue to have this discussion? And just to add a little context, because I know there's a number of new people here today, we've regularly brought up the idea of where do we hold these discussions compared to things like the details on the workloads APIs and how do they get really down and deep, and how do we, what SIG should own those and how do we do it? And we had a fairly large room of people at KubeCon last December where that was part of the discussion. And the overwhelming response there was, keep all of this in SIG Apps. And so now it's approach, and and for us who've been doing this for a very long time, the question is, should this still be part of SIG Apps? If not, why not? And those kinds of details. And so that's kind of a bit of the context, because this conversation has come up, and as the community who's been around has said, we should just continue to have this here. And so,
but does that mean that this is the only place where we can discuss those? Is this 1 hour block and share it with all the other topics that are in SIG Apps? Or is it just to say that we should have conversations outside that are also public, but then bring them back in a 10-minute summary slot? Like, that's the part I don't understand about in SIG Apps or out of SIG Apps. What does that mean?
So SIG Apps, if I understand the governance structure here, because this is all governance related to Kubernetes, is an organizational unit that schedules meetings, can own code, has a certain governance structure to it, because that's one of the things now being laid down within Kubernetes is a lot of governance structure. But from a pragmatic side, it's just the organizational unit. And you'll see we already have regular sub-meetings for various topics. Things like Helm and charts are good examples of that. We've also had one-off meetings that will just meet around different topics. And we're not the only SIG to do this. I know things like Service Catalog SIG, and I think Paul can probably discuss this more, has had one-off meetings throughout the week and sometimes regular meetings on the same topic repeatedly to dig down deeper into these kinds of issues. Right, and they can use the same meeting creds. We all have the same logistical calendar to work off of and the same tools, but we meet in subgroups of those SIGs. And so instead of having this massive flat structure of lots of SIGs and working groups, it becomes now subgroups of a SIG to, okay, we've got to dig deeper on this particular topic. We can meet outside of the normal time. Let's just figure out a time and schedule meetings. And if we've got to have 1, 2 meet regularly for a month or 3 months, we can, or ongoing indefinitely. And that's one of those things that we have been doing in SIGs, and SIG Apps has long done that.
So I think, just to use examples from a couple other cases, the SIG cluster lifecycle has a number of dedicated meetings for its subprojects. It actually incorrectly calls some of those things working groups, but really they're just subprojects. Like the cluster API meets, COPS has office hours, KubeADM has office hours, things of that nature. So that's totally fine. As a what I consider kind of a more legitimate working group example, there's the resource management working group, which is a collaboration amongst SIG Node, SIG scheduling, and SIG autoscaling. And they actually report back through SIG Node mailing lists and such as their convention. So there's kind of precedent for that as well, to have kind of a home SIG just to simplify coordination and make sure that people stay in the loop there. But it's been a while since I've been involved with that, so I don't know how much they directly circulate information amongst the other SIGs involved versus their own forum. I think they don't actually have their own mailing list, where a number of the other working groups do. So we don't have a consistent pattern currently. I think, if you, based on what Vic said, I think one of the primary concerns is just making sure that there is enough time. And based on comments of some of the other people on the thread, they want to have a space where they don't have to sit through maybe other topics that they're less interested in. So I think in terms of the logistics of getting this started, I don't know. Governance-wise, I wouldn't expect this group to actually have any code in Kubernetes eventually. So it doesn't really, wouldn't make sense as a SIG itself, for example. A number of their chat messages going on in the chat about multiple work groups or multiple SIGs being interested. I think Matt's original example was he actually came from kind of the SIG cluster lifecycle space where the topics became less generally applicable to this cluster lifecycle. So that's where it kind of grew from that direction. And I guess Eric Feda had said that the SIG testing and contributor experience may also be interested, and they built their own multi-cluster mechanism for testing. And they might be interested in that. So I don't know if anybody has any strong opinions about the governance of the effort. People are just looking for a place where they can start talking and figure this stuff out.
So Joe Beta has his hand up. He's actually using the app to do it. So Joe?
I know it's a new feature in Zoom. It's fun. But
I was going to ask about that. Where does that show up?
It's if you go to the participant list, there's a button that says raise hand and lower hand.
Okay.
So right now the SIG apps README, I don't see a charter there, and I don't know where y'all are at in terms of thinking around charter, but the README says covers deploying and operating applications in Kubernetes, which is really very different from developing applications that are targeted at Kubernetes. Now, there's a ton of overlap here, obviously, and I think that we see a ton of overlap between operating stuff on Kubernetes, developing stuff for Kubernetes, describing stuff that's like with app def across these things. I think one of the things that I think a lot of folks are struggling with, and this is something that crosses SIGs, is how do we actually take this large sort of like hairball that is, developing, deploying, operating, all that stuff, and start teasing apart the different layers so that we can actually build an ecosystem of tooling and concepts around this. And so in my mind, at least reading this, proposing a working group that is focused on the development workflow is outside the current scope of SIG apps. Now that may not be de facto sort of what SIG apps has been doing, but just reading the README, that's what I see.
Yeah, so I'll add a couple of things here for context. One, that README got updated a while ago, and none of us SIG leads noticed. And it changed a little bit of the wording and context if you go back a while. So we need to go get that cleaned up. Some of the language was changed. It used to be much more developer focused and developer friendly. And so that is one of those things. When I went back and I read that the other day, it caught my attention. Wait a minute, we haven't watched this in a while. So I'll go back and we're going to update that. But then there's also the question of how much of the developer tooling and flow is supposed to be in scope for Kubernetes. Right. So one of the things that we talk about with Kubernetes is we've got the Kubernetes core, and that's the official thing. And right here, we're talking about a whole bunch of tools that are not part of Kubernetes. Now in SIG apps, we've traditionally gone out and branched into those things, even though they're not an official part of the Kubernetes scope. And so the question of scoping also raises how many of these conversations should be facilitated and part of Kubernetes on the books, because we're talking about a whole bunch of sub-projects that aren't really sub-projects of Kubernetes. And we're talking about, it's kind of the whole thing of, should my IDE, talk to the GNU tools and the Linux folks, should they be facilitating these conversations? And so, yes, Joe.
Yeah, so I think that that actually makes the case for a working group more than anything else, because a working group cannot hold code. Really what it is just a place for folks to get together and talk about this stuff. And I agree that these things aren't part of Kubernetes proper. And I don't think, I think it's great that we're seeing an explosion of tools that exist outside of Kubernetes. I think providing the right forum for folks to get together, understand, build understanding, interoperability, that makes a ton of sense around that stuff. So, the in or out of the Kubernetes code base, I think is in some ways moot, or supports a working group.
So a while ago, when I asked about the same thing, with the ecosystem working group in that, the feedback that I generally got was we're talking about a lot of things that are not part of Kubernetes. And so therefore, is it Kubernetes' responsibility to facilitate those conversations that are at a much higher level than Kubernetes itself, right? And so I'm curious if there's a difference in thinking now out of y'all, especially those of you who control and manage the scope of Kubernetes and what should be in and discussed where. Notice I'm just trying to get to clarifying questions here. And that was just like 4.5 months ago. So I'm kind of curious on the clarity of thinking around this when this topic came up last time.
I don't remember the topic before.
Okay.
I would be supportive of Kubernetes providing a home for discussions. I think we've been very liberal in terms of doing things like creating Slack channels for sub projects. I think, or for community projects. And I think the repository rethink stuff that Brendan led, where there's this idea of what was associated projects, also is a way of sort of enabling the community without trying to necessarily own it. So that's my take.
Okay, and so I'll get back to one of the other questions that has come up though. Oh, I'm sorry, Brian, you had something as well. I see a finger up.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I was just reading back through your thread, Matt. I think part of the issue was timing in terms of, we said we were, for example, changing the policy on repositories and things like that. We should go back to it. I actually thought your idea of leveraging the CNCF landscape is very interesting. And the other example I just wanted to bring up was SIG Big Data, where, obviously the Spark side of the integration is not in Kubernetes proper, but if there are mechanisms that in Kubernetes that need to be evolved in order to support that, that's where code would live in Kubernetes, although I don't think that SIG is actually going to own any code in Kubernetes proper. So it's definitely the case that we're kind of skirting the edge in a number of areas. So it is going to be kind of a judgment call for how, which discussions happen within the community on an official basis and which ones do not. We're looking for more ways of supporting those things but still keeping the project manageable.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the questions that I'll ask then that has come up in chat a little bit is that SIG Apps has typically been the conversation point for this. And so this is a regular part of all of our ongoing meetings. And so if this scope gets moved out elsewhere, that really does cut down a significant amount of what SIG Apps does, right? A lot of what our calls are and the purpose of it. We'll actually probably have trouble filling a lot of our meetings. So the question is, why isn't SIG Apps the right place for this if the conversation has already been happening here? And I know a number of the folks who've come in, this is actually your first meeting. And so the question is if we have the conversation here and it's been going on here and we've got the time, why is this not the place? Matt, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I'm using the features too. So I guess I just want to say that historically a lot of the discussion has, obviously I think both of us come from a bit of a biased background. You kind of hosting the SIG Apps meetings and me working on some of these developer tools. I would say that from my point of view, historically, a lot of the discussion has not happened in SIG Apps. I'm not a regular SIG Apps contributor, but I've worked on a lot of these developer tools, and a lot of these developer tools and meetings have actually happened outside of SIG Apps. So I'm not sure how much has actually happened in SIG Apps. I know there have been a lot of demos here, but I'm not sure if a demo is equal to kind of the deeper discussion that we're trying to target with this working group.
So this is Richard. So I work with Telepresence and Forge, and we've had a conversation with Matt, and I would echo what Matt said. We've had pretty extensive conversations with a bunch of other folks from other organizations just around adopting tooling that for various reasons didn't seem like it fit on SIG Apps, but we certainly have demoed telepresence on the SIG Apps call. I think I'm totally supportive of actually reporting out or giving updates because I think communication is good. I don't think there's any objection to that. The other thing I'd point out is that with the working group, I think the target persona is very clearly the developer, and operational concerns I think would not be in scope. I think with SIG Apps, it's a little more hazy around, if you're deploying an application, there are stakeholders from an operations standpoint as well as a development standpoint. And I think those concerns make the conversation more complicated. And so sometimes I think it's harder to focus just on the developer experience, which is, as I understand it, sort of the primary scope of whatever governance structure we're talking about, right? So
one thing I wanted to point out, everyone seems to be focused on the first sentence of the app special interest group blurb. The second sentence is we focus on the developer and DevOps experience of running applications in Kubernetes. So traditionally, we always have kind of had this community where we're focused on everything from design to decommissioning, right? The value has been that you get perspectives from a diverse set of people with different backgrounds, right? And it's insightful having someone with primarily an operations experience give you the operations perspective and impact on your developer tooling, to me at least. That being said, like, to me, the value proposition for this new working group is that we want to take an hour of time every week and bring together multiple SIGs and have a conversation that focuses just on developer tooling. The thing about it is the people who've been contributing to this conversation for a couple of years, I want to make sure that their voice is also heard inside of this working group. And if that's going to be the case, they're going to have to, come and participate if they want their voice to be heard and give an extra hour of time, of their time every week. So like, my main thing is, what is the output of this group going to be if we do it? Like, if we're asking people to give an extra hour of time every week to participate and have their voice heard and help shape the direction of developer tooling in the community in general, what is the output of the working group going to be that's going to make it worthwhile? Like, is it going to be a recommendation, a set of best practices? Is it going to be, I don't know. Like, what do you guys want to develop?
The first output of a first meeting would definitely be figuring that out. What we know so far is that there are a lot of people interested in this one topic. And so we want a space to kind of talk through what does it mean to have output? What is the output of a group like this? What does the tooling space look like? What kind of buckets do we have for different tools? Like, all of that kind of definition still has to happen.
Okay.
And I think getting that going is necessary.
Michelle has her hand up.
Well, I wanted to say one more thing. I guess my only concern is that because it's so vague about what the output is going to be at this point, if we just keep doing working groups every time we want to have do we need to have a working group every time people in the community want to get together and have a conversation on an ongoing basis? Is that something that actually requires governance? Like, I mean,
that's a fair question.
Like, if you want to have a conference call on a weekly basis, I don't see why we have to do that. If it's something where we want to bring the community together and, there's going to be output to some SIG, there's going to be action items, we need to track it, we need the governance around it, then it makes a lot of sense to me. But if it's not that, then, do we want to do this every time somebody wants to get together and have an ongoing talk?
Yeah, and I think that one main goal of ours is to not be exclusionary, right? We want to have as many people who want to participate with this level of depth in this conversation as possible, to be participants in it. So we don't want to go off, have a call with 2 or 3 people, and then, that's it. We want to have it be as part of the community as much as it can, or as much as makes sense. But it's seeming difficult to find that balance.
Well, one thing, last thing.
Can you give Michelle a chance?
Sure.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. So I just want to give context. 2 things. One, a lot of this is a little bit hazy because we don't have a lot of definition around what a working group is and why you create it and all of that. And Joe's been working on that. So I hope in the future this becomes a more clear and well-defined conversation. And then on the SIG Apps perspective, I helped co-found SIG Apps with Matt like a few years back. I also work on developer tooling. I work on Draft. I work on Helm and some other things. So I wanted to say, as someone who helped bring this group together, the original intention was to get to a place where we could talk about developer tooling. But the thing is, the bits and pieces weren't in place at the time. This was so far back. We've been working on kind of setting the foundation to actually get to this point to talk about developer tooling. Things like Minikube weren't around. The workloads API wasn't stable. There were all these bits and pieces. People didn't really know how to do CI/CD. People were having a hard time defining Kubernetes manifests, and all of these things have gotten a lot easier. So we're finally at a place where we can have the conversations around developer tooling, and we have been having those conversations in SIG Apps. And I agree, there should be more focus on it. I'm really passionate about this space. I would love to talk more about it. But we've set the foundation here to talk about this particular thing. And we're finally here, and now it feels like we're trying to break off or kind of go in a different direction. And I agree, with Ken, the scope of this SIG would be very, very narrow if we took away that particular piece of what SIG Apps is. Brian has his finger raised, so I'll pass the mic.
I'm only seeing one screen at a time, so if someone's on the other screen, speak up now. Anyone? No? Okay. So I just wanted to make a proposal. It sounds like the leaders of SIG Apps are saying they believe it's in scope and they're willing to dedicate time to the topic. The people in the work group said, when I asked on the thread, said they think they'd start at an hour every other week. Does SIG Apps want to donate an hour every other week to the discussion? If they are willing to try that, it seems like we should just move forward trying that. And if that doesn't work, then we can split it out into a separate meeting. That seem reasonable? Sounds like SIG Apps people are interested.
Folks, I'll say if you like this, please +1 it in the chat, and we'll get some opinion over there.
Because I think what I keep hearing is one of the main concerns is that there's not adequate time or too many other topics, and certainly looking at the past agendas, I think some of the perception came from that. It would take potentially weeks or longer to get demos scheduled, and there was a lot of time spent on stand-ups. But if that's, if they're willing to make space, it seems like there's no harm in just trying that.
So one point I'd want to make here is, and I think we struggled with this with the app dev working group a little bit, making sure that, that this becomes sort of a safe space for folks to share new ideas without saying, hey, we already have a solution for this, or why don't you use XYZ tool? I think making sure that this is a place where we can, redefine the lines is I think an important thing. And I think that's that might be one of the drivers for why folks were so intent on a working group, is to have a little bit of a clean slate in terms of exploring the solution space.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the whole safe space. And if SIG Apps is not, people don't feel it's a safe space, please come let us know, because that is never our intent. We always want to see new shiny things here. And if you're not comfortable talking to the co-chairs of SIG Apps, please reach out to one of the other people in the steering committee and say, hey, I want to pass this on. And I know they'll pass it on to us. I do want to say one other thing before we get into something like another working group. I would really like to see, and so here's my pitch to you, and I've already pitched this to Aaron and some of the others, that before we get another working group, let's get updated docs on that working group so they can be held accountable to that from the steering committee. That's my only thing. I would say that no matter how we do this, I know SIG Apps would be willing to either include time. We could try including time in our SIG Apps meetings, and I'll be happy to sit down with Kim or anybody else on figuring out those agendas and whatnot to make sure that it's a good starting point. And if not, I know we'd be happy in having subgroups that have the SIG Apps credentials, and we can upload the videos because we like to record everything, especially for demos and stuff like that, in order to get this stuff online.
One thing I would add is that I think we would be happy to take an hour every other week and start working on like scoping, that week to developer tooling. But I also think it might be worthwhile to, as we were setting up this working group, just knowing kind of what had gone on in SIG Apps and reading the charter, it was unclear that this was really in scope. And coming from our world, it didn't seem like it was at all. Otherwise, we would have, brought it up much earlier instead of on the thread. But just kind of finalizing. I know you guys are working on it now, but finalizing what exactly is in scope for SIG Apps. Is Minikube part of SIG Apps? Is a local cluster development? Is CI/CD in scope for SIG Apps? Just so that we have a better idea of what fits in where. Because right now it seems. I don't know if we could effectively have a group that focuses on both the developer and the operator, because I feel like these are very distinct user stories in the Kubernetes world. So.
Okay. You know what, though? I think that's a great conversation to hash out and to talk through where those lines are and where they're not. I know a lot of folks have talked to me about, well, the developer and operator have the same expectations on them. And in smaller teams, that can be very true. But then you get into the larger organizations where you get 1,000 people working on the same app, then you might only have a handful of people who deal with the operations, and a lot of people deal with the developing, and they don't even know what's happening. And so there's a lot of separation there. And so we get to these roles and who does them and how it's different in organizations. Brian, you've got a finger up.
Time check. We're out of time, so I just wanted to follow up on next steps.
So I would suggest that the next steps would be to look at when we I would suggest doing it as part of SIG Apps, but that's also partly me saying don't do any new working groups until the working group documentation and charter and governance stuff is in better shape than a single paragraph. I would suggest in SIG Apps we're happy to donate time to this, and I'd be happy to get on the phone to organize the future meetings on that going forward to look at how do we fit it in. I do understand that there's topics of CI/CD and stuff like that, and I'm sure Michelle is smirking a little bit at this because she organized a couple-month period where all we did in here was talk CI/CD workflows and developer tooling around that. So I would like the opportunity to try to incorporate this into SIG Apps, and if that doesn't work, we can look at breaking it off into its own meeting or whether it makes sense as a working group. What do folks, I got a bunch of +1s before, but I think there was a little bit of pushback too. So I'm not sure what folks are you okay if we try that?
Well, I just want to point out, we kind of voted on this in the SIG Apps meeting, so maybe we should take that back to the deadline list, so it's not only SIG Apps people.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, so yeah, let's close on the mailing list then.
We'll close on the mailing list, and we can bring it around next week here to continue whatever happened in the mailing list to rehash audio-wise. If you have an opinion, again, the list is included, or the mailing list link is included in today's meeting minutes. There's one final question. I know we're a little over. Should we move it to a mailing list or a form? Does anybody have any perspective? I will facilitate a form if folks want a form.
What's a forum?
Oh, sorry. Form, F-O-R-M, not forum.
Oh, form.
Like a form, like an anonymous voting form where people can choose yes, no, without.
I would say the form sounds good as long as we have an idea of the results. That's good for me.
I can put together an anonymous form that we can send out. I'll get that done later today.
I'd also just like to point out, there is a third option here, I guess, which is what you kind of suggested a minute ago, Matt, of just waiting until the working group charter proposal process is more fully fleshed, and then we can revisit if that's going to be soon.
And we can continue to talk in SIG Apps, and if we need time in other meetings, I'm happy, the SIG Apps co-chairs are happy to help schedule those and facilitate, make sure they happen. All right. I guess I'll put the form together and put some context into an email and add it to the list.
Thanks,
Matt. Thanks, everyone. This was a fairly long conversation, and thank you, everybody, for your involvement, and I hope to see you all here back next week. Thanks, everyone. That's it. Have a wonderful week.